The Battle of Omaha Beach is one of the most famous episodes in the Second World War. The acts of bravery by members of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions on D-Day morning are rightfully often mentioned. However, other units participated in the initial landings as well. The involvement of 2 Sherman Tank Battalions who were there from the start of the battle is too often overlooked. In this video we will take a closer look at the actions of the Sherman tanks from the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions at Omaha Beach. For the American Normandy landings, 3 tank battalions separated were called up to land in the initial attacks on the beaches and help pave the way for the infantry. These tank battalions were called separated as they acted outside an armoured division's jurisdiction. They were, as the name suggests, a separate tank battalion. While the 70th Tank Battalion was attached to the 4th Infantry Division to land at Utah Beach, it was the task of the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions to aid the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions during the assault on Omaha Beach. The 3 battalions had been specifically equipped for their daring assaults on the landing beaches. A tank battalion had a headquarters with an administrative company which was reinforced by a platoon of Sherman assault guns. These were the regular Sherman tanks equipped with the 105mm howitzer gun. Next to the headquarters company, the battalion also had a service company to provide the battalion with the necessary maintenance. The main body of a tank battalion consisted of the 3 medium tank companies, A, B and C. Each of these companies counted 17 Sherman tanks. To further strengthen the battalions was a company of M5 light tanks, Company D. However, for the Normandy landings, this company was left behind in England. The 741st Tank Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Skaggs. Skaggs' battalion was tasked with aiding the men of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Regimental Combat Team at Easy Red and Fox Green, the 2 easternmost landing zones of Omaha Beach. Companies B and C under the command of Captain James Thornton Jr. and Captain Charles Young would be deployed first. To adhere to the strict schedule, they were to land 5 minutes prior to the infantry to start clearing the exits. These were also the Sherman tanks equipped with the famous duplex drive systems. This was a canvas system, turning the tank more into a boat. That way they could be deployed much further on in the sea and bob their way towards their assigned landing zones. Following them was Captain Cecil Thomas's A Company. They were to land precisely at H hour. Captain Thomas's tanks were equipped with the deep wading kits. These are snorkels placed on the decks of the engines to keep it going and to keep the air flowing in spite of being submerged. These would be dropped closer to the shoreline from where they could drive ashore. The 743rd Tank Battalion, posted to support the 116th Regimental Combat Team of the 29th Infantry Division, had the same composition. Lieutenant Colonel John Upham's battalion would be led by B and C companies of Captains Charles Emker and Ned Elder respectively. They too would bob ashore in their Sherman DDs. 5 minutes later, also A Company of Captain Vodra Phillips would land ashore in there with deep wading kits equipped Sherman tanks. For the Normandy landings, each of the medium tank companies would field 16 Sherman tanks. It was important to maintain cohesion during the landings. Nonetheless, a part of the platoons was put on a different boat so that the entire platoon wouldn't be destroyed should one of the boats go down. Engineers were also assigned to a vital mission. They would be among the first to land, and their tasks consisted of clearing the main obstacles on the beach, especially the concrete ones which couldn't be destroyed by the Sherman tanks. It was a key objective to clear a path for the Sherman tanks to use so that they could help pave the way for the infantry. Replenishment was also a major point to consider. In order to keep this as low as possible, the Sherman tanks of the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions were fully stocked, sometimes even carrying more than usual, just to prolong their potential time in combat as much as possible. After loading everything onto the vessels, the Allied Armada set sail for Normandy. After a postponement of 24 hours owing to poor weather, H hour at Omaha Beach was eventually set for 6:30 AM on June 6, 1944. The US 5th Corps was ready to assault Omaha Beach. Opposing the American tanks and infantry would be members of 5 companies from 2 different regiments. In the trenches at Verville were the men of the 11th Company, Grenadier Regiment 726. The neighbouring sector at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer was held by the 10th Company of the same regiment. Between Saint-Laurent and Colville-sur-Mer were the 5th and 8th Companies of Grenadier Regiment 916. At Colville itself were the members of the 3rd Company, Grenadier Regiment 726. These were all well dug in the Widerstandsnester, or resistance nests, and had various machine gun bunkers, artillery and anti-tank positions at their disposal. It was the latter that would be the main threat for the Sherman tanks. In spite of the heavy pre-landing artillery barrage, most German resistance nests remained standing. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Companies B and C of the 741st Tank Battalion plunged into the sea at exactly 5:40 am. The decision to drop the tanks into the rough sea was made by both company commanders, Captain James Thornton Jr. and Charles Young. The inexperienced officers decided to proceed with the plan and take the risk of letting the tanks go. In their defence, the battalion hadn't trained in rough conditions like the one they faced on D-Day morning. The difficult decision being made, the tanks dropped into the water at some 5,500 meters from their target, Easy Red and Fox Green. Of the initial 32 Sherman tanks, 3 couldn't drive off the ramp, leaving only 29 tanks in the water. But as soon as the tanks were left to the Channel Sea, they began to face trouble. Water was gushing over the canvas, and several Sherman tanks sank to the bottom of the sea. Nearly 27 tanks came into trouble, frankly, immediately after being dropped off. A lot of these tanks had taken damage to the canvas covers of the DD system. Fortunately enough, most of the crews managed to escape their vehicles. Only 2 of the initial wave of 32 tanks managed to land on Omaha Beach. The 2 tanks were later joined by the 3 Shermans that initially failed to clear the ramp. The 5 tanks, all belonging to Captain Thornton Jr.'s B Company, landed on the Easy Red sector, where they immediately entered the fighting for Omaha Beach. One of these Sherman tanks was commanded by Sergeant Geddes, who managed to destroy 2 German guns near Exit 3. On the flank of the 29th Infantry Division's 116th Regimental Combat Team, it was decided that the sea was far too rough for the Sherman DDs to be dropped into the water. Companies B and C of the 743rd Tank Battalion were therefore dropped off at the beach by their LCTs, or landing craft tanks. Disaster struck as B Company landed ashore. While the first LCT safely dropped off its 4 tanks, the second landed straight in front of an 88mm gun at Vierville. The LCT was sunk before it could drop off its load, which included the tank of Captain Emker, the company commander. Emker was killed along with 1st Lieutenant Turner and 2nd Lieutenant Alice. Lieutenant Hodgson was also wounded in the process, leaving 1st Lieutenant Beaver as the only unharmed officer in B Company. In quick succession, 8 tanks of B Company were knocked out. The company commander was killed in action and only 1 officer of the company was still fit to fight. The other 8 tanks of the initial 16 landed in the Dog Green sector just opposite Vierville. The 16 tanks of C Company managed to land on the beach at Dog White and Easy Green. They were, however, heavily dispersed all across the beach, and 1 tank was immediately destroyed upon touching down. At 6:30 am, the tanks of A Company of both tank battalions on their turn reached Omaha Beach. The LCTs contained 2 tanks, each followed by a dozer tank. While A Company of the 743rd reached Easy Green and Dog Red without incidents, the 741st lost 1 tank as they reached Easy Red. One of the barges had exploded due to an unknown cause. Just like the other tanks, 2nd Lieutenant Barcelonas immediately started pummeling the coastal defences with high explosive shells. 1 anti-tank gun at Easy Red was quickly silenced due to the 75mm shells. Of the 64 tanks already engaged in the fighting at Omaha Beach, 36 were put out of action before they could participate in their role to open up the predetermined exits of the beach. However, of the 32 tanks of both companies A of the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions, only 2 were lost. In the sector of the 741st Tank Battalion, meanwhile, a few tanks were dropped off too far from the beach, and the crews were forced to abandon their Sherman tanks as their engines simply drowned in the sea water. The tank dozers, tasked with clearing the beach of obstacles and clearing the way for the other Sherman tanks to facilitate a drive inland, were also having a difficult time. At 10 minutes past H hour, the platoon tank dozer, under the command of 1st Lieutenant Frank Klotz, touched down at Easy Red. They immediately went into action, clearing several obstacles from the beach while under heavy fire. Private Ayers' tank dozer of the headquarters platoon was apparently hit by an 88mm round and put out of action. The 16th Regimental Combat Team at Easy Red was ground to a halt, owing to the intensity of the German fire. As mortars and artillery was raining down, they were also fired upon by multiple machine guns from WN-65 and 64. The time was 7 am. The second wave of tanks may have arrived. The infantry was still hopelessly stuck behind the pebbles. Over at Dog Green in front of Vierville, only half of the initial 16 tanks foreseen by B Company, 743rd Tank Battalion, were left. In the neighbouring sector Dog White, the losses were less severe, with C Company, also from the 743rd Tank Battalion, still capable to deploy some 15 of the initial 16 tanks. We already saw how A Company 743rd Tank Battalion was able to land without incidents. So A tanks were able to land safely at Dog Red, while the other half of the company deployed at Easy Green opposite WN66. At Easy Red, casualties were starting to mount. Of the 24 tanks planned to have landed, only 15 managed to touch down without incidents. Most of these came from the 741st Tank Battalion's A Company. The situation was even worse at Fox Green opposite Colville, where only 8 tanks of the initial 24 arrived. The 1st Infantry Division had to push on, with only a few tanks supporting their attacks. At 8:20 am, the commander of the 741st Tank Battalion, accompanied by his operations officer, arrived at Omaha Beach in the Easy Red sector. Contact needed to be established with the 24 tanks of the battalion that were left in fighting condition on the beach. However, the radio had become waterlogged, rendering it useless to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Skaggs. Runners were sent out instead to contact each tank individually. The company had to make do with what they had. Under the murderous fire, both runners quickly became casualties. By 11 am, orders were dispatched to concentrate all the remaining Sherman tanks of the battalion near the Easy 3 exit. 3 tanks quickly concentrated their fire on the various pillboxes on the cliffs above. However, they quickly drew counterfire, resulting in the loss of 2 Sherman tanks. By that time, the 16th Regimental Combat Team had managed to move up, and they were battling it out at the foot of the ridge. Fire onto the beach was slackening. The Americans were finally gaining the upper hand. By 1 p.m, the reserve tanks of the headquarters company touched down on the beach. These strengthened the few remaining Sherman tanks left. They were unable to support the infantry at that stage and instead helped to clear the beach of obstacles. Finally, at 3 p.m, also the repair crews landed on Omaha Beach and started to repair the many damaged tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion. While the Tank Battalion was still licking its wounds, the men of the Big Red 1 Infantry Division pushed inland and cleared the exit without much tank support. Later that day, the 5 remaining tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion were ordered away from the beach to take up new positions to the east of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. The landing at Omaha Beach had decimated the battalion. They were subsequently withdrawn from the front line and replaced by the 745th Tank Battalion, which landed in the night of the 6th to 7th of June 1944. Although the 743rd Tank Battalion had a relatively good landing, they were quickly put in difficulties as the engineers had endured heavy losses under the murderous German machine gun fire. The engineers were to clear a path for the Sherman tanks as the latter was unable to destroy the concrete defences with their 75mm guns. All this resulted in a traffic jam on the beach, causing the tanks to remain in the open without much room to operate. The concrete obstructions at Dog 1 were only cleared by dusk, close to 10 p.m. With the rising tide, the tanks of companies A and B were forced to spread out along the beach to prevent them from being submerged in the sea water. Nonetheless, the Sherman tanks of the 743rd Tank Battalion provided valuable support to the infantrymen. With the Navy ships ceasing their fire to prevent blue-on-blue incidents, the tanks were the next best thing to provide fire support. In the course of the afternoon, A Company endured the loss of 8 more of its tanks, while also the battered B Company endured several losses at this stage. C Company came out relatively unscathed, losing only 2 tanks in the battle. It was estimated that by the end of the day, after the obstructions had been cleared, the battalion of Lieutenant Colonel John Upham still had 39 of the original 56 tanks in running order, most of these being from C Company. Unlike the 741st, the 743rd remained on the front line. The battalion even participated in the actions breaking the Rangers' encirclement at Pointe du Hoc. The duplex drive and deep wading kit Sherman tanks were not the protagonists at Omaha Beach. That role was played by the infantrymen of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. Nonetheless, the tanks did prove to be invaluable in eventual victory at the beach. While both the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions were fighting their own battles against the Germans and the elements, the engineers tasked to clear the concrete obstacles were succumbing to the heavy German fire coming from the resistance nests overlooking the beach. Once on French soil, the Sherman tanks drew fire from the larger German defences, undoubtedly resulting in fewer losses to the infantry storming Omaha Beach. This, however, resulted in the loss of several Sherman tanks. By midday, most of the 741st Tank Battalion had been wiped out, either by the sea waves or by the murderous fire coming from the German defences. Because of this, the infantry was left on its own to clear the exits. The 743rd Tank Battalion to the west was plagued by the obstacles which hadn't been cleared. In spite of the setbacks that morning, the Sherman tanks were the only reliable source of direct fire, and it was also thanks to the tank support that the Omaha Beach defences were overcome. A testimony to the bravery of both battalions that day can be reflected by the fact that the Tank Battalions were given the Presidential Unit Citation for their actions on D-Day. The 741st Tank Battalion had 45 men killed and a further 60 were wounded. The 743rd Tank Battalion had also suffered terrible losses, certainly among the officers. However, 9 members of the battalion were awarded with the Distinguished Service Cross for their actions that day. This was the Ace Destroyer. I thoroughly hope you enjoyed the video. For more of the same, I can highly suggest these videos here. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to catch you in another video. Cheers!